You're listening to the UKC Hunting Ops Podcast, celebrating hunting dog heritage, competition, and community. United Kennel Club has been the hunting dog sports home for coonhounds, beagles, retrievers, pointers, cur, feist, and more for over 125 years.
Thank you guys for tuning in. I'm Domenick Moya. I am the Hunt Test and Field Trial Program Manager here at the United Kennel Club. And I am joined by Johnny Myers. He's a veterinarian, and he's going to sit here and talk a little bit with us about dog safety, especially as we start to get into those colder months, focusing on our waterfowl dogs and really all hunting dogs and some of the things that we need to look out for. But before we dive too far into that, Johnny, do you mind giving our listeners a little bit of a background on yourself and where you're located?
No, sure. Once again, I'm Johnny Myers, veterinarian here in Paducah, Kentucky. I've been a veterinarian since graduated veterinary school from Mississippi State University College of Veterinary Medicine in 1994. Immediately on graduation, I moved back. This is kind of where I was born and raised, so set up practice here and have been here since that point in time. And if you're kind of semi-familiar with geography of the United States, we're kind of in that little tip of Kentucky, the very far western part of it, there at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River. So obviously we're right in kind of the heart of the waterfowl world, and that's kind of what I guess I grew up, kind of cut my teeth on as far as in the duck and goose hunting world. Really right in old Ballard County, Kentucky, which was once proclaimed the goose capital of the world. I don't think we can claim that title anymore, but it was good while it lasted anyway.
Yeah, I don't know what's the deal with waterfowl lately, but it's like I've hunted Mattamuskeet a few times. The Mattamuskeet used to be a huge destination to hunt, and the times that I've been out there, it's just not like what people always built it up to be. And this seems like waterfowl is shifting, the flyways shift, everything constantly changes. But it's funny. I know you've talked to Todd Kellum before, and we've had him on the show quite a few times, our vice president here. You ask that man about goose hunting, he will tell you that he would not cross the street to shoot a flippin' goose.
I would call him a bold-faced liar. I know Todd Kellum too well, and I know Todd's never turned down any opportunity to pull a trigger. So I don't think that has one morsel of truth in it.
That's funny because I've told him about some of my geese hunts and goose hunts. I guess it would be goose hunt, but
well, I guess it depends on yeah.
Yeah, it depends on how good of a hunt it is. It might just be a goose hunt.
Yeah.
But that's his go-to phrases. I won't cross the street to shoot a flippin' goose.
Well, it's I've always loved the waterfowl world, and I love Canada goose hunting. I love duck hunting. It's just all of it's good. And I think we all kind of go through those different seasons of things that we kind of like as a favorite or as a go-to sort of thing. And so much of it you have to think about even in kind of what you've been exposed to, right, and how you were exposed to it. And as a kid, you and I were talking yesterday a little bit. The number of coon hunts and different sort of stuff that I went on as a kid. When you're 7 or 8 years old and you're trying to follow adult men through the dark, their legs are just a lot longer, and they have a little better lay of the land as far as barbed wire fences and different sort of stuff, and some of those, sometimes when you're introduced in a certain way, it's just not as good as others. So I think maybe Todd just had a bad experience.
Maybe so. Maybe he got chased around by a goose by the local pond a little too many times.
Yeah, it could be. I could see him as one of those park park goose victims. I could see that.
Yeah. Well, while we're on the topic of geese, I'll ask a vet's opinion on this. You might have come across something that I haven't thought of, but I'm a big proponent of using as much of anything that I hunt as possible. And so one of the things that I've done recently is use goose feed as a little not chew toy, but like a little enrichment chew, I guess, for the dog. What are your thoughts on that? I'd typically take them and freeze them for a few weeks to try to kill off as much as I could, and then not cook them, just kind of give it to them frozen. What are your thoughts on that as a vet?
Ooh, I would be really hesitant on anything like that. Number one, in this day and age, we kind of think about the spread of different disease, whether it's avian influenza and different sort of things, which is a little out of the companion animal world. But we think about that and potential disease processes. So anything that I don't have kind of the good old USDA seal on it of approval, I'm hesitant using anything like that, and that extends to we get lots of folks that want, whether they're deer hunters or different sort of stuff, and that don't necessarily want to leave any waste. But anytime we're talking about an animal product that we haven't cooked or processed or whatever, the bacterial flora that we may be introducing to that animal, I would be very, very cautious or even warned against doing that, to be honest.
Okay, well that's good to
Now,
know.
from a job security standpoint, that I guess that I could encourage that, but from a preventative measure, I would say that's probably not the better of ideas.
Hey, that's good to know. I think it's one of those things I picked up off of a Facebook forum somewhere, and it seemed like a good idea, and dogs seemed to like it. But with that in
Well, I'm
mind,
sure.
might avoid it in the future.
Yeah, I think that would be in abundance of caution. I think that would be wise.
Sure. Now, while we're talking about animal safety and specifically dog safety, one thing that I'm kind of curious heading into season here, I run poodles, which most of the listeners probably have heard that in the past, but they're not the typical waterfowl dog. You've got your labs, double coated, waxy coat, oily, and it's meant to repel water. And one of the big things around that is when you get into those cold months, repelling water and trying to keep the dog warm enough. I kind of want to dip our toes a little bit in talking about canine hypothermia and some of the signs, what it really is, and what to do if you find yourself impacted by it. So, I guess from 30,000 foot, what is hypothermia in dogs?
Well, yeah, hypothermia is just simply a drop in the body temperature below that of normal. So it's hypo meaning below. So the normal dog temperature is going to run on average between 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit up into about that 103.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So we start getting below that, then we truly have a hypothermic animal or hypothermic dog. So in that, it's just like a person, many of the same clinical signs that we see or you hear about with people who've gotten too cold, hypothermic, or whether it's a little bit of sluggishness. Obviously, dogs don't speak, but you can see differences in their mannerisms, in their response time. The uncontrolled shivering. Um, uh, those are some of the things that we begin to look at. I know from a standpoint here, that we're moving kind of from a situation where we've been talking about in this area, and obviously through the summer months, hyperthermia or heat stroke sort of scenarios or heat related illness. That's a big topic. But as you're very correct, as we move into the fall seasons here, and we're whether it be upland or waterfowl or what have you, as you begin to kind of pursue those sort of things, any of those activities, we can look at temperatures, whether it be ambient temperatures or water temperatures, different sort of things where hypothermia can be experienced. And it's, I guess I get in a little bit of a conundrum, but when we start trying to focus on one or the other, whether it's too hot or too cold, as far as the dog's body temperature, because right now, and as we're in October and these upland seasons, depending on where you're at, either one of those processes could occur. Okay. And it could occur within the same day, literally, because of temperature changes and just depending on where you're at and what kind of activities that you're involved in. So I think it's fair to really look at both sides of the coin a little bit. And as we've kind of established that heat related illness thing's probably been hit pretty hard through the summer months. And now we don't want to forget that, though, because those sort of situations are still very, very likely to occur. So we want to be cognizant of that. We don't want to just kind of flip a switch thinking, hey, it's fall and I'm not worried about heat, because it doesn't. Eukanuba has done there's some fantastic things that I've looked at on their website pertaining to heat related illness. And so you can look at those sort of things. And one of the big things there is where they kind of just using a general rule of thumb, looking at the ambient temperature and humidity. And when you add those together, if we get into that 140 sort of value, then we can begin to look at the a cautionary thing as far as heat related illness. We don't have such a good parameter involving whether it's too cold as far as caution there, because once again there are a lot of variables that come into play, and I'm sure we'll kind of discuss some of those as we move forward.
Yeah, saying that, it brings up a good point that I've heard of a lot, and I think it sometimes gets missed. When you talk about hypothermia or dogs getting too cold, I think in a lot of people's mind they're thinking, oh, that's if you're out breaking ice and it's snowing and it's below freezing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? It like if your dog's doing bigger swims and the water temperature is low enough, it can start to cool their body temperature, right?
Yeah, to be honest, probably. I mean, I've seen those what I'll term acute, where it happens at that moment in time, where we see those dogs that, as it transpires. From a clinical standpoint, from veterinary practice, I've probably seen more situations of hypothermia that are probably 2 or 3 days in the making. And by that, I mean the dog is exposed to different changes in their environment over a period of time where that heat has just been sort of zapped out of the dog, and they've kind of lost all their compensatory mechanisms. They just can't generate heat anymore. For instance, we get these, especially with a lot of your bird dogs. I've seen it for whatever reason. I've seen it a couple of different German short hairs, where we get some of this just cold, rainy weather. Maybe there's some ice involved with that, but it's over a protracted 2 or 3 day period where they've been out in that. And we have to think about even when they're running, where I'm taking the dog out, if I'm trying to kick up a covey of quail or whatever the case may be. But I'm taking one of those dogs out and they're expending a lot of energy on the hunt itself. And if they're having to fight cold in the environment as well, that's a huge energy drain on that dog, and on their body. So over a period of time, 2 or 3 days, they just run out of basically fuel in the furnace, and those clinical signs onset. And to be honest, a lot of those are a lot worse than some of the acute ones because we just don't maybe pay as much attention to that.
That's really interesting to hear, because you tend to think water related, but it brings up a good point how it can affect some of the dogs that are just on foot running running upland birds, or it can happen just as much to the coonhounds or the beagles out there as well.
Oh yeah.
Um, especially, guys take them up north or something, and it's just a cold few days. The dog just doesn't get a chance to recoup, and they burn all those calories, like you said. Um, that kind of puts a little bit more into perspective that it's not as acute as I personally was thinking that it was.
Yeah, and I think that's, and I guess even with this past week, here at the clinic, we've seen several different dogs with some heat related illness. And once again, I don't know that all those were necessarily an acute sort of thing. I think over time, once again, they just kind of, that thermostat kind of gets out of whack, and uh, they lose that ability to kind of compensate. So, um, of course, as I'm, we're sitting here doing this podcast, and I look, behind you, and you've got kennels there, inside and whatever. Um, I think that's important, and I don't want to forget to mention this is, a lot of times just giving that dog an opportunity to kind of catch up, right? So, bringing it inside or whatever into a climate controlled environment after we've been in those extremes, so they're just not expending energy, whether it's to warm up or to cool down, either one, just every now and then giving their body a break, especially when you're hunting hard and doing those sort of things. If you have to think, if you're tired, what about them? And muscle soreness and different sort of things. It's just if you're kind of like me, or you, and I know the dogs are, they just get so excited sometimes they forget, and especially with the younger dogs or the older dogs. The younger dogs just don't sometimes have they've not got the game time under their belt to understand a little bit of control, right? And kind of pacing themselves a little bit. And I don't care what that is. The older dogs are kind of more like myself. It's a situation where their can do and their want to have kind of parted ways. So they just have to we have to compensate for that as well.
Sure. And kind of while we're going into this topic, what are some situations or some factors that can exasperate a hypothermic situation or build towards a hypothermic episode?
Well, of course, if we think about retrievers, one of the biggest things I think about that is, obviously we're thinking about water in a lot of those cases, like you mentioned, and water is such a good conductor of heat, right? And it tends to be away from the animal since that those water temperatures are colder, so that can create a big dilemma for them, and we know that, right? That just kind of goes without saying. So, given every opportunity to sort of we use a lot of the people are always asking about like the neoprene vest and different sort of things, and hey, it's kind of like them wearing a coat or whatever. In all honesty, I'd have to say the jury's still out on that. It does provide a little bit of insulation. We can see that, we think about it, but the dog and how they, what I'll term thermoregulate, how they're regulating their temperature, we think about that coat, and whether it's of a retriever or that poodle, whatever the case may be. One of the biggest components of that is that coat, especially of the retriever world, that water repellency and whatever. I mean, it's made so it traps air between the hair and the skin. So we're allowing that to sort of help warm the body, and that they regulate that themselves. If I'm using a vest or different sort of things, I really don't allow that expansion of that hair. When a dog shakes, you think about dog comes out of the water and it shakes, and how the hair is kind of standing on end, and as it goes back down, it's trapping that air, right? So they're using that to help regulate their body temperature, whether to warm or to cool. Those vests may preclude some of that from actually happening. And I have seen hypothermic dogs with the neoprene vest. And sometimes I think it may add a little bit of a factor there that we have to take into consideration, because that it's obviously not keeping them dry, right?
Mm.
Water's still going in between that. And guess what? Water can actually freeze between that vest and the animal. And they don't have any way to get rid of that, right? They don't have opposable digits. They can't undo the zipper or slide out of that thing and say, hey, I've got ice inside this thing. And I've seen that happen personally, where it forms in there, and that's actually one of with one of my own dogs, where it happened,
Mm.
where ice formed in there, and I see it. So I always exercise caution that we're, in those sort of things, I want to keep that dog as dry as possible, right? We know that those conditions, that water it's a variable that we can control a little bit whether they're in the blind or whatever, that, or on a stand or whatever, that kind of taking a chamois cloth or a towel or something like that and kind of helping to wipe off some of that excess, I think is a good thing. And if you're in a boat or in a blind or whatever, one of the big things that I really recommend is utilizing some sort of, whether it's like one of the little kennel cot sort of scenarios or like the platform stands, you're using something like that the dog can sit on, that's elevated so water can drain away from the dog. They're sitting on the floor of a John boat or something like that. I mean, that's cold. Whether it's just the metal or that surface that they're on, and man, they're losing a lot of body heat. So utilizing something to elevate them just a few inches or whatever, so at least the water that they can drain off them, so we can help facilitate that, so they're just not sitting in a puddle of water, or which ends up being a puddle or ice if it's cold enough. So we have to understand that just sometimes just kind of looking at that dog's environment a little bit can go a long way towards preventing a problem.
Very good point. Um, it's interesting about the dog vest thing because those are so widely used now. I've got some personally. Uh, it's an interesting take, and it's something I've thought about too, about keeping water in there, and how does that work? Does it offset the fact that the dog's body heat's warming the water in there first, or does it negate that fact? So that's definitely good food for thought about the
Yeah,
potential
and
effectiveness of
I, I,
vests.
I would love to see some more studies done, or some studies done on it, to be honest, because it can't be too warming if I've got ice forming in there, right? So that dog's, if it's given up, and if it's given up enough body heat to melt the ice, I know that now that dog is definitely in a deficit, right?
Mm.
So it can't be forming in there and not causing a problem.
And out of curiosity, or to add another factor to that, um, it's kind of my understanding that dogs do a lot of thermoregulation through their paw pads and through their face capillaries and ears and things of that nature. Is that mainly for heat dissipation, or does that also play into like cold water? Are they losing more heat out of their paws or out of their faces anyway?
Well, obviously with different vasodilation or constriction methods, whether the vessels are enlarging or actually constricting, to allow more blood flow, or obviously restrict it. Uh, they can help regulate that in the heat or the cold, as far as that type of thermal regulation. But it's one means, right? It's just one means of many. But in the cold, uh, as we begin to shunt more blood towards the core in order to really, the body's going to try to preserve organ function above all, right? Whether it be muscle or those sort of things. It's kind of got its checklist of priorities that it's looking at to maintain life. And kind of the lower tier things first are the ones that are the most expendable, get kind of shut off first, right? So as we shunt blood inward, then all of a sudden we begin to lose that we're kind of taking that mechanism off the table, if that makes sense. So, but that's where we begin to see clinical signs too, right? And the shivering and different sort of stuff, because that's a those are the things that we're looking at when that dog, and kind of watching their mannerisms and their actions, kind of understanding animal behavior. What is going on with them at that moment in time, and then trying to be a little bit preventative in our measures to keep things from furthering.
With Eukanuba, I've found digestibility is as good as it gets. I've also discovered daily rations are less, with a solid stool and no waste. I've not had a dog that doesn't like it or that hasn't performed as good or better on Eukanuba. But don't take my word for it, folks. Give it a try. Eukanuba, the official performance dog nutrition partner of UKC.
Okay. And as we start to talk about that vasoconstriction and dilation, that's the blood vessels, getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and
Right.
that can play into another cold-related issue of frostbite, right? As that blood flow starts to slow, it could lead to frostbite.
Right.
What?
Exactly.
How do we look at frostbite signs in these dogs? I mean, it's not like us where our hands start turning black or they start losing color because they've got fur all over their paws, their paw pads are underneath them. What are some signs for us to look out for as far as frostbite?
Because you're not, when you think about the dog, especially the retriever in this instance, when I'm kind of looking at them, we think about extremities mostly with frostbite, right? With uri, whether it's your facial features, ears, or those things that are kind of hanging on by a thread, right? Kind of the leaves of the tree sort of thing are where we kind of see those sort of things, exactly like what you're saying. So. In the canine, we don't see that quite as much in those areas. The digits and what have you, I tend to see that more where they're running in environments, potentially like snow cover, whatever, where ice can kind of form in some of those areas and be pressed against the skin. So that's in my experience. The only time that I've ever seen frostbite are on those areas where basically ice has been accumulated. I can't say that it obviously wouldn't happen just with air temperature, whatever. It very well could. I just never personally seen that. So, that's where I'm always very cognizant of those little icicles forming on anything or whatever. I know that's bad, right? That's what I've got to take all measures to keep that from happening. In our retrievers, well, I say that our Goldens and some of the poodles, you get into the upland dogs, man, with a lot of your setters and different sort of stuff with longer hair, especially on the feet. I think we can take a little bit of preventative measure there and make sure that all that is trimmed really well. Just taking a little pair of beard trimmers or whatever, making sure that hair so that doesn't accumulate there, is just one little thing. In the retriever, I'm just kind of watching them because they're usually right by my side, right? They're not off from me for any length of time generally.
Okay. And I guess that brings up the point of like our big running upland dogs or the coon hounds that are running in and out of streams or on cold ground. I guess that means the risk of frostbite just from contact like that is a little bit slimmer, where it's a little bit increased risk when you have that ice accumulation, like you said. Or is there still a chance of frostbite from being on foot on the ground?
There's still obviously a chance there. So I mean, I think it's just kind of caution and kind of evaluating the dog, right, and kind of looking and seeing. I guess the bigger concern in some of those situations, as far as frostbite or hypothermia in general, other than what we're actually doing, is probably in the transport. To and from the field is where we kind of get. Sometimes we don't maybe use the best judgment at times, or kind of evaluate that situation, because I don't care how much you just spend on whatever brand of XYZ kennel, right? Or
Mm.
trailer or whatever it is, we need to really evaluate that carefully as far as, what kind of airflow and what kind of insulation that is providing for that dog, what kind of protection it's providing for that dog. Um, that's probably my obviously then the obvious sort of things in the field that we see. That transport's the one that may get neglected a little more.
That brings up a good point. Is that to kind of say, uh, extremely cold weather, putting the dog back there just is increasing their chance of frostbite, or what? What is the main concern
Oh,
there?
I
Is
would.
it their nose from sticking their nose out the kennel slats, or what? What is the biggest risk, or what part of the body is the biggest risk for frostbite? I guess in this
I would
situation.
say whatever is exposed there, because once again we begin to get into situations there in the hypothermic situations and kind of the body preserving the core heat, that some of those, like you're saying, whether it's sticking its nose out or wind blowing on that dog, um, if the dog's put in there, if you kind of put them up wet, right, and then we're in the back of that truck or whatever, and even though it may have a cover on there or different sort of stuff, that depending on the environmental temperature or the humidity and the wind back there. I mean, we're flying down the highway at 70 miles an hour. We're creating a pretty good wind chill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we got to be really cognizant of that and how long that dog's been back there and exactly what that temperature is. Um, one of the things that I started recommending for everybody is just you can basically pick up these little uh, outdoor thermometer sort of deals, like you use for your house, right? The little weather
Mm.
station deals. And, they've got all kinds of little variations of those, and most of them are just a little double A battery or whatever in the transmitter and receiver both. But putting one of those, somewhere in that crate, as far as so I can actually evaluate what is that temperature in there, right? So I
Mm.
can look at that in real time in the cab of a vehicle or whatever. If they're not in like an SUV where we're in the same environment and I know what that temperature is. Because I just really don't know, right? I mean, you're just kind of guessing. So I kind of like taking the guesswork out of that and utilizing something like that. It's cheap and you can just leave it in there, right? And kind of look at that. And I get a real time temperature on that. And if you are using um, like a crate or whatever, and you've got one of the covers on it, and we roll it down or whatever, and we've got it inside that area somewhere where I can, not where the dog can obviously chew on it or mess with it, but somewhere where it's in there where I can get a pretty good evaluation of that environment that dog's in, that temperature, I think is a really, really good idea.
That is a good idea. I might have to add that one to my list of things to upgrade my rig for this season.
Sure.
Now, when we start to look at situations like that, you had mentioned before, keeping a chamois or keeping a towel. Uh, I've even heard, people wanting to grab old military wool blankets. Um, what are some other things that you like to keep on hand, either maybe not just the things to dry the dog off, but just things to keep on hand as you enter those winter months with the dog?
Well, I mean, depending on the situation and kind of once again, if you've got one of those uh, little indoor, outdoor sort of thermostat, you can kind of get a good idea. But if I'm kind of thinking, hey, they need a little heat in there, um, depending on the situation, number one, can I, if we're traveling, can I get them in the cab of the vehicle, right, where it's uh, environmentally that temperature is controlled. If I can, and I'm looking at, hey, they're in the back in a crate or whatever, you have to use caution with that. But there's a couple ways we can kind of add heat to that a little bit if we want. A lot of the newer vehicles, newer trucks, and what have you will have uh, electrical outlets there, and then the bed of the truck, right? So if you happen to have one of those, utilizing some sort of heating pad or whatever, I think is very acceptable. Obviously, we're trying to be cognizant of water and other dangers, right? And I don't want it when the dog can chew on it. But if I can, put that under the crate, um, and provide a little heat to that as heat rises, I think that's an excellent idea because the dog's not directly on that, and if I've just got it under the crate and letting it run like that as we're going down the road or whatever, I'm definitely helping the situation. Um, I think that's a great idea. Potentially using some of the heat packs, you got the little hand warmers and different sort of stuff. Um, if I've got a dry vest and the dog's pretty, and I can kind of tuck those in some area that's not directly on their skin. If I think they're a little chilly and we're just kind of sitting there and we're just trying to kind of warm up, that's not out of the question. We just have to use caution, because, you know, it, kind of like a kid, I don't, I, I can't predict what they're going to do with anything, whether they're going to chew something up or whatever. But used appropriately and with caution, I think some of those things are some pretty good options.
Yeah, no, I like that. Um, as we get into, so we're talking about how to keep them warm. What are some preventative things that we can do to keep dogs from finding themselves in those hypothermic or frostbite sort of situations? What are some things that we can help do to prepare them for those colder weather conditions?
Well, if we're thinking outside of what I can influence within their environment, kennels and all that good stuff. If I'm just kind of thinking about the dog themselves, um, as an athlete, I'm looking at them from that standpoint, and we're thinking about conditioning, right? So that dog that's in good shape is going to have a much better chance of maintaining proper thermoregulation, right? They're just in shape. So when they're not, obese or overweight or just completely out of shape, they're going to have a much better chance of just being a much better starting point. Um, Now, with your conditioning, everybody's kind of got their, I don't think it's wise to try to hunt their way into shape or do that sort of thing. I think that all starts kind of with some training at home, and it never hurts. Just like for ourselves, we kind of we can start out kind of with us walking and then running out in the field or whatever, just in the normal conditioning and training. Uh, I'll kind of put that on in one segment, and then we kind of look at nutrition, obviously, and kind of where we're at there, because just like us, you are what you eat, and that sort of dynamic plays a big role. We see it in human nutrition, especially with that of athletes now, where man, really fine tuning those sort of things, right up, from every minute prior to the workout, during the workout, and recovery phases and different dynamics, that we are really dialing that into a true science. A lot of work, there's been a lot of companies, and Eukanuba being one, kind of on the forefront, not just in the sporting world, but in the working dog world and whatever, really looking at that very segment of nutrition and how it influences or can kind of uh, help alleviate some of those things that we're talking about. So I think really looking at the plane of nutrition is important there too, and that kind of plays back to that proper weight management and those the conditioning as well. But that every dog's different, every situation is different with that. The good news is now that we, just like I'm talking about with human athletes, we've done a lot of fine tuning with some of the diets towards particular activity. So I think that's a conversation that's well worth having with your veterinarian or whatever, to kind of see where we're at in that dynamic.
Sure. I know I've heard a lot of people talk about it before, and I don't know if it's a commonly held belief or if it's just in some of the circles I run in. But you'll hear about guys wanting to bump up the volume of food that they're feeding dogs going into the colder months with the idea of creating fat stores. Um, I, what are your thoughts on that? I kind of feel like, I personally feed Eukanuba. One of the things I like about it is that I don't have to change volumes. I can just change formulas to fattier formula, or lean it out in the summer, or things like that, and keep feeding the same volume. But as a vet, what would you say to those people that are like, oh yeah, as we enter fall, I start bumping up the volume that I'm feeding the dogs for, the sake of making them more cold resilient?
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of a double-edged sword there from a standpoint of, I know with increased activity, if I'm hunting harder than I'm training, right? If they're spending more time, more physical activity with that, I know that they're going to need a few more groceries on the shelf, right? They're going to need more energy. That the dog eats to meet its energy requirements. That's rule number one. So I know if I'm increasing their energy outgo, they're going to need more put in, or we're going to begin to lose body condition, right? So we know that whether it's a change in volume or a change in a formula that may have more calories per cup, or however you want to look at that or evaluate that, I know that I'm going to have to increase it if the if the if the hunting activity is going to be more than the training activity, or is that it increases. So uh, yes, there may be some validity to increasing that volume or changing formulas, or both, right? I just don't know, because it's very individual. That I see so much now. The guys that are really training so much now with a lot of the hunt test, and that whole thing, and I don't care what flavor that is, whether it's with the upland guys or the retriever guys or the coon hunt. If you're training a lot and whatever it is, you, there's not much variation in day to day with that dog, right? So it doesn't change really season to season. They're just rolling from one thing to another, and that physical activity never really stops. So that you can kind of put those guys on one shelf, and they're probably not going to change much of anything. For the average guy that doesn't compete like in a lot of those sort of activities, or necessarily train intensely year round, but hunt really hard, yeah, there's probably some adjustments that they're going to have to make.
Alan, I know we both have new Dogtra Pathfinder 2s. How are you liking yours so far?
I'm liking it. I've even had the opportunity now to use mine where I didn't have service, where I download the map of that area, and it works flawlessly. Love it.
I agree. I really like my Dogtra Pathfinder 2 as well. I've used it quite a bit the past few months. I really like the crystal clear maps. I like that it doesn't lose service very much, and I don't have many bad things to say about it at all. Dogtra Pathfinder 2, the official GPS collar partner of UKC.
Okay. Good to know. Now I also want to touch on worst case scenario happens, right? You do everything you can to avoid it, but you notice signs of hypothermia in your dog, some of the signs we talked about earlier. What are the next steps? What do you do? Do you, break out the heating blanket like you said, or is it a gradual temperature rise? What do we need to do if we find ourselves in a situation with a hypothermic dog?
Well, we're going to get it dry, right? We're going to get it somewhere in the warm, hopefully in a vehicle and headed to your veterinarian, to be honest, because it's, what I really want to do in that situation. I don't, as I warm the dog, I want to get it in a warm environment. And I may, in the interim before I get it to the veterinarian or whatever, whether it's in route or prior to, I'm going to try to get that dog as warm as I can, right? But it's kind of hard to do that in any, if I'm sitting in a duck blind or whatever. I mean, maybe I have heat, maybe I don't, or whatever. But I'm trying to really see to get that dog, get it dry, get it wrapped up right, so I can provide that warmth like you're talking about, whether it's blankets or whatever that is, or your parka or whatever I can get on that dog to help insulate it from further heat loss. Ideally supplementing some heat, whether it be from getting it inside, or the cab of a vehicle or whatever it is, and then then get it to the veterinarian for evaluation, so we can kind of see where that core temperature is and what have you. And it's either side of the fence, whether it's hypothermia like we're talking about or hyperthermia. But there's a fine line we do there where we kind of cross a threshold and overshoot and create a whole nother dynamic. So um, I, I get asked that a lot, and with different, I've got one of the UKC's competitors running a big deal in kind of our backyard right here right now, and that's been a question too. And what do they do? And I'm like, hey, why don't you just let it be what I'll do, and get that animal to the veterinarian and give us a chance to kind of get that evaluated. Obviously, doing the things that I've kind of mentioned and that you mentioned in the interim, just to prevent whether it's further heat loss or trying to get the animal cooled in some measure.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've always kind of wondered, is there a chance of shock if you warm the dog up too much? Like, there's so much. I see it all the time. There's those heated jackets now where it's got a little power bank and you can bump it up and make it nice and toasty in there. So I didn't know if you have this dog, get it dried up, you're heading to the vet and you're throwing one of these heated jackets or something on it. Is there a risk of shocking the system? Or
No, because the thing is with those sort of things, and that's a great idea. I kind of keep looking for somebody to kind of develop that product for the canine world, to be honest, kind of like you're talking about. But like these heated jackets, I think that kind of Milwaukee Tool, I think's got a pretty good selection of those sort of things. But I think that's an excellent idea and something that you might kind of keep in the back of your mind that, hey, I can use one of those, or they make these blankets the same way. Battery operated or whatever, that those aren't going to produce enough heat to overshoot from that. They're not like an electric blanket or whatever. They don't get quite that hot. And that's probably a better methodology to kind of put on that dog in the interim to kind of let them warm up a little bit. I think that's a great idea.
Okay, well, good, because I've got one of those hanging in my my hunting closet, so I might make sure to have that in the truck or something just in case.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I think those things have different areas, that like on their vest or coats that actually produce the heat. But if I'm trying to warm the dog, I'm really looking at, like we say, that we've kind of got that checklist, right? That where it's protecting that core temperature. So, I'm really looking at, if I have to apply heat to a particular area or warmth to a particular area, I'm really looking at that core, like from the basically the dog's axilla, the armpits along the chest region, the heart. That's because the old ticker it's kind of circulating that fluid. So as it circulates the blood in that scenario, whatever, so it's kind of helping warm that core. It's going to get to the extremities from that point and kind of let that natural vasodilation or constriction, let the body kind of do its work. It knows better, right? The good Lord designed those perfectly. So we kind of want to kind of take notes from him and say, okay, well, let's go in reverse order and kind of how we what the body's trying to preserve. Let's put the heat there first.
Yeah, almost like creating a mini water heater inside them, sending hot water out to
exactly.
the extremities.
Exactly.
And so that I've always kind of wondered about that too, because you've heard it as well with hyper or heat stroke. About, well, you don't want to cool the dog off too fast. You might shock their body or anything like that. So that doesn't necessarily hold true for heat stroke as well, or does it?
For the cold, is that what you're
for heat stroke?
For hypothermia?
Yeah, the other side of the spectrum.
For heat, for heat stroke, you definitely can cool them too fast or whatever. Those, because the thing is, I'm still worried about the core. Everything that unless I'm using some sort of IV fluids, whether they be warm fluids or cool fluids, right, for whichever case that we're trying to maintain there, I'm not able to get anything else internally into the dog, right? So everything's external, so it's got to kind of take time to work. So if I if I do things too quickly, if I throw them in ice water, if the dog's too hot or whatever, I'm going to fight the body's natural way of doing that, and I create a world of problems. With heat, somewhat the same way, but hopefully no one's applying the type of heat. I'm really trying to just raise the ambient temperature and letting. That's really all that we could ask an owner to do. Is really that outside, the outside influence, the ambient temperature. So I can apply some heated blankets or whatever, but everything's external. But I'm really trying to make a kind of a cocoon around that animal or whatever, like to warm it, to warm the entire body.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. Well, that kind of answers a ton of my questions. Do you have any big hunting plans coming up for this waterfowl season?
Well, I've always subscribed to one philosophy, and that's we're not going again till tomorrow. So that sort of thing is try to hit it every day possible. So, and most of the hunting I do is right here, kind of in my back door where we farm, my family farms, and so that I look forward to waterfowl season. Whether it's from dove season forward, there's something we're kind of trying to pull the trigger on here or there. So that's kind of the goal.
Yeah. My brother, who's never duck hunted a day in his life, I don't even know that he's deer hunted before, but he was at a little banquet to support a good cause, and he bid on a big duck hunting and fishing trip up in the Ulations, Alaska. And he ended up winning this, and so he just got back from that. But he was sending me all these pictures of them shooting, brant, lessers, pintails, just about anything you can think of. They were up there, and for a man that
And this
had never
never
done
hunted?
it before, say what was that?
He's never hunted.
Never
He's
before.
never hunted. And so,
Not that I know
wow.
of.
Okay.
And I think it was one of those things that he thought it was a good cause, and he had reached out to me about possibly being his guest on it. But when we were looking into travel, I couldn't quite swing it up to the Ulations. I don't know if any of our listeners are too familiar with that area, but
he did thank you.
Yeah. But
Well, that's cool.
And it was the pictures he was sending me. I was happy he got to enjoy that, and that was his first experience into hunting. Because I'm like, now it'll be that much easier to pull him to go on a trip with me to Arkansas, or even get him to come here to North Carolina and go on a trip, because he just got started off on the right foot up there. But man, that's
but the other side of the coin is now that bar is pretty high, right?
Yeah.
And so him going with you may remove a lot of doubts that he's had growing up that you are the lesser brother. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, maybe. That's a good point, though, that you make, that going up to Alaska and shooting birds up there is going to be a lot different than trudging through a North Carolina sandhill swamp with me to shoot a couple wood ducks.
Yeah. Yeah, you could be the worst guide ever,
Probably am, if we're being honest. But
well, there you go.
I try my best.
As long as
That's right. Well, Dr. Myers, I greatly appreciate you hopping on our podcast today and getting the opportunity to spread this awareness as we head into duck season about some of these risks that we have towards dogs. And it's a fantastic point you made at the very beginning about how on the same day you could have a risk of heat stroke or hypothermia, and just being in tune with your dog, being in tune with the conditions is paramount in preventing one of those situations. So I greatly appreciate your expertise. I'll refrain from giving my dogs any more goose leg chews, and wish you guys the best season out there in your Paducah. And
well, thank you.
Hopefully we can get together and hunt one day.
Well, I would enjoy it. You have an open invitation, so
Fantastic. That would be a heck of a hunt with Goldens and Poodles. That one might get some attention.
Well, it could. I just don't know from who, but
If it's the right kind of attention.
yeah. Well, Todd Kellum will not be invited. Then we'll just put it that way.
Oh yeah, I could imagine what he would have to say on it.
Well, I'd hate for a man to kill a limit of ducks or whatever over some Goldens or poodles that way. I wouldn't want to embarrass him, so I'm going to remove him from that the fear of that whole situation.
Oh, what a favor you're doing him.
I am. I'm that kind of guy.
Well, Dr. Myers, thank you again, and we hope you guys listening enjoyed our episode and were able to glean a good bit of information from it.
Thank you for listening to the UKC Hunting Ops Podcast. Be sure to give us a follow so you don't miss any of our new episodes or content.